Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty unexpected, the origins of computing.
Oh yeah, definitely unexpected.
Yeah, we're taking a look at an excerpt from Meredith Whittaker's Origin Stories, Plantations, Computers, and Industrial Control.
It's a really thought-provoking piece.
Yeah, it's kind of wild how connected those things actually are.
Yeah, we often think of like computing as purely about technological progress, right? But Whittaker argues that it's deeply connected to social and economic forces,
Right.
especially the legacy of plantation labor systems.
It's definitely a connection I never really considered before, so where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with Charles Babbage.
Okay.
He's often hailed as this like computer pioneer.
Right, the father of computing.
Right, but this excerpt paints a much more nuanced picture of him.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it turns out that he was also a social theorist
Really?
who was really concerned with industrial labor and his ideas on managing workers.
Yeah, they were a bit unsettling.
So he wasn't just inventing cool gadgets, he was really thinking about how these machines fit into the whole system of work and power.
Exactly. And the timing is key here. So Babbage publishes his book on the economy of machinery and manufacturers in 1832,
Okay.
just a year before Britain takes steps to abolish slavery in the West Indies.
Wow, so he's writing about worker control right when the British Empire is grappling with the end of slavery. There has to be a connection there.
Right. It's like you can sense this anxiety, about finding new ways to ensure productivity and keep control over labor, even as the system is like changing.
So Whittaker talks about plantations being surprisingly modern in their management techniques. What did she mean by that?
Well, plantations, if you think about it, they were using data, metrics, and labor division to maximize output way before factories did.
Yeah.
It was a brutal system, but undeniably organized and innovative for the time.
It's like when we think of plantations as backwards, we're missing part of the story. They were using techniques that would later become central to industrial capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. And these methods of control that were developed on plantations get transferred to factories during the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
And that's really where Babbage's work comes in.
Okay, but factories used free labor. Right, so how does that fit into this whole picture?
Well, the concept of free labor is a lot more complicated than it sounds.
I bet.
Workers might technically be free because they weren't enslaved,
All right.
but there were still these huge power imbalances between workers and factory owners.
Of course.
And often those factories borrowed heavily from plantation tactics to control their workers.
So this freedom was kind of an illusion. They might have had a contract, but they were still stuck in a system that controlled their lives.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. And Babbage's theories were all about trying to figure out how to maximize control within this system of supposedly free labor.
Oh, okay. Now, didn't he also kind of build on the ideas of Adam Smith, the guy who wrote about the division of labor?
He did. So Smith famously argued that breaking down tasks into smaller parts could make production more efficient, right? But Babbage took this further, pushing for even more extreme divisions of labor.
And that's where his Babbage principle comes in. The one about using the division of labor to justify paying people less.
Exactly. He basically argued that if you break a task down into really simple components,
Okay.
you can call those components low skill and then justify paying people less for doing them.
It's pretty shrewd.
It is. It's kind of brilliant in a very cynical way.
Yeah. And Whittaker points out how this whole idea of skill was often racialized, right?
Oh, absolutely. There was this underlying assumption that white workers naturally possessed skill, while black people, especially those who had been enslaved, were seen as incapable of having it.
It's just another way of justifying racial hierarchies within the labor system, even when slavery is being abolished. So we're already seeing how these ideas about technology and labor are intertwined with issues of race and power. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Whittaker connects Babbage's work to some historical events, like the Swing Rebellion. Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, yeah. The Swing Rebellion was this huge uprising of British workers in the 1830s.
Okay.
They were smashing machines, protesting low wages, and basically saying, we don't want this kind of work.
So even back then, people were pushing back against the changes brought about by industrialization. It's like they thought that progress wasn't necessarily good for everyone.
Exactly. And it's really interesting. Whittaker actually draws this really surprising parallel between the Swing Rebellion
Okay.
and the Christmas Rebellion in Jamaica. which happened around the same time.
Wait, you're talking about a connection between British workers and enslaved people in Jamaica?
That's right. Both uprisings were about challenging these existing power structures, albeit in vastly different contexts. But they were both about fighting for control over labor and resisting exploitation.
So, Babbage is developing his theories and inventions against this backdrop of worker unrest and rebellion on both sides of the Atlantic. That really adds a whole new layer to the story, doesn't it?
It does. And for Babbage, automation was seen as a way to address these quote-unquote labor issues. He even argued that worker strikes actually encouraged the development of machines to replace those very workers.
Whoa. It's like he's saying, if workers cause trouble, let's just replace them with machines. Pretty chilling.
It is.
But this wasn't just an abstract idea for Babbage. He actually started designing these machines, right?
Right. So he developed two main types, the difference engine and the analytical engine. And these designs were very deeply influenced by his ideas about labor division.
So he's not just building machines that can calculate. He's trying to replicate the control and hierarchy of a human labor system.
Yeah. But with machines instead of people.
That's a great point. And it's even more apparent when you consider the analytical engine, which is considered like a precursor to modern computers. It was inspired by the jacquard loom, a weaving machine that used punch cards to automate the weaving process.
That's right.
The jacquard loom used punch cards, just like early computers. And I think I even remember reading somewhere that the loom's inventor was almost thrown into a river by angry workers because they saw his invention as a threat to their jobs.
That's a great story.
Yeah. So even way back then, people understood the potential for automation to displace workers. And it's fascinating how this fear is like woven right into the story of computing from the very beginning.
Yeah, it is.
And it's not just a symbolic connection, right? Whittaker points out that Babbage actually designed his analytical engine with features specifically for worker surveillance.
Oh, you mean how it was designed to print out results throughout its operation?
Yes. I always thought that was just for debugging. But are you saying it was also a way to monitor what the worker was doing?
Precisely. It's like an early version of a time clock,
Wow.
constantly tracking and recording the worker's progress.
That's mind-blowing. So even though Babbage was obsessed with efficiency and automation, he still wanted to keep a watchful eye on those workers. Control was clearly a major theme for him.
Yeah, it was. It really raises this important question. What does it mean to be free in a system where work is so tightly controlled?
That's a really powerful question, and one that I think we're still grappling with today as technology becomes more and more present in our lives.
For sure.
Okay, so we've uncovered this deep connection between early computing and plantation logic. It's pretty unsettling to think about those power dynamics baked into, like, the DNA of modern technology, you know. But I'm really curious, how does this history actually play out in the technology that we use today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, it's one that we could spend multiple deep dives exploring. But I think for now, let's just focus on a few key areas where this legacy is still very much alive.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so let's start with something that you probably encounter every day. You know those targeted ads that seem to follow you around the internet?
Oh, yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, so it's all part of what's called surveillance capitalism, where companies like Google and Facebook are collecting massive amounts of data on our online activities.
Yeah, I have to admit, those targeted ads can be a little creepy sometimes. Like, it's almost like they know what I'm thinking before I even do.
Right, and that's exactly the point. By tracking our online behavior, these companies can build these incredibly detailed profiles of like who we are, what we like, and even what we might buy next.
And then they use that information to manipulate our behavior and make a profit. It's like we're constantly being nudged and influenced even if we don't realize it.
Exactly. And the really scary part is that all this surveillance is often presented as a good thing,
Right.
in the name of efficiency and personalization.
Like it's all about making our lives easier and giving us what we want before we even have to ask for it. But it feels like we're trading our privacy and autonomy for convenience.
Yeah, that's the trade-off that we're increasingly being asked to make. And it's important to remember that these technologies, as convenient as they may seem, are deeply rooted in that history of worker control and exploitation that we talked about earlier.
It's almost like Babbage's time clock, but on a massive digital scale. So instead of punching in and out, we're constantly generating data that's being used to monitor and analyze and ultimately control our behavior.
That's a really great analogy. And it's not just happening online. So think about the gig economy, with platforms like Uber and Lyft.
Yeah, okay.
They present themselves as empowering workers, by giving them flexibility and control over their schedules.
Right, like that whole be your own boss kind of thing. But I've heard from friends who drive for those platforms that the reality is a lot different.
You're right to be skeptical because while there is some truth to the flexibility aspect, these workers are often subject to really intense surveillance and algorithmic control.
Wait, what do you mean by algorithmic control?
Well, the apps that these workers use are constantly tracking their location, speed, and even how they interact with customers. And then these algorithms determine everything from which rides they're offered to how much they get paid.
So it's not just about driving people around, it's about being managed by an algorithm that basically dictates your every move. It sounds a lot like that plantation logic we were talking about earlier.
It absolutely does. And just like those factory workers back in Babbage's time, gig workers are often classified as independent contractors instead of employees, which means they lack a lot of those basic labor protections and benefits.
So they miss out on things like minimum wage and overtime pay and even sick leave. It's like we've taken a step back in time, only now it's an algorithm calling the shots instead of a human overseer.
It is, and it's a worrying trend that's becoming more and more prevalent as automation and AI kind of seep into every aspect of our lives. We're seeing it in warehouses, we're seeing it in factories, even in some white-collar jobs.
So what can we do about all of this? Is it all doom and gloom? I mean, are we just destined to repeat this cycle of exploitation? I have to admit, I'm feeling kind of discouraged now.
I hear you. It can be really overwhelming to think about all of this.
Yeah.
But I really do believe that we can change the course of history, and I think the first step is understanding the problem, seeing these historical patterns, and how they're being replicated in these new and kind of insidious ways.
Knowledge is power, right? But what comes after knowledge? How do we actually translate that understanding into action?
Well, for one, we can't just keep buying into this narrative that technology is inherently neutral and progressive. We have to be way more critical, asking tough questions about who's benefiting from these technologies and who is being exploited.
So it's not just about innovating for innovation's sake. We need to really consider the social and ethical implications of technology before it's unleashed upon the world.
Absolutely. And we need to start designing and implementing technologies that prioritize human well-being and social justice, not just profit and efficiency. And that means pushing for things like data privacy laws, algorithmic transparency, and even stronger worker protections in the gig economy.
Those are some pretty big systemic changes. But it feels like there's also something that we can do at an individual level.
You're absolutely right. Supporting movements that are fighting for worker rights in the digital age is crucial. Things like unionizing gig workers, advocating for platform co-ops, and just holding these tech companies accountable for their actions. Every little bit helps.
It's like that old saying, think globally, act locally. So we need to think about the big picture, but also find ways to make a difference in our own communities and spheres of influence.
Exactly. And I think Whittaker's work is so important because it gives us that framework for understanding these really complex issues.
Yeah.
And it helps us connect the dots between those seemingly disparate phenomena like plantation labor systems and modern-day surveillance capitalism.
And ultimately, it empowers us to act. It reminds us that we're not just passive consumers of technology. We have the power to shape its development and to use it for good.
Yeah, that's a really powerful message, and one that I think resonates with a lot of people.
So where do we go from here? What's the next step in this journey of understanding and action?
Well, I think it's just about keeping the conversation going. We need to continue learning, questioning, and challenging the status quo. And most importantly, remember that the future isn't predetermined. We have the power to create the world that we want to live in.
I really like that idea of reclaiming our power, right?
Yeah.
And actually shaping the future of technology, because it's so easy to feel like we're just along for the ride, at the mercy of all these giant tech companies and their algorithms.
I know what you mean. But we're not powerless, right?
Right.
Like every choice that we make, every product that we buy, every app that we download, it all sends a message.
Mm-hmm.
It sends a message about what kind of future we want to be a part of, right?
So it's all about being these conscious consumers and making these informed choices about the technology that we're inviting into our lives, I guess.
Exactly. And it's about holding those companies accountable. It's about demanding more transparency and ethical practices. So we can do things like vote with our wallets, we can support organizations that are fighting for digital rights, and we can just make our voices heard. through things like protests and petitions, through social media.
Like you said before, the future is not predetermined. So we do have the power to change things. It just takes collective action and a willingness to actually challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most important things that we can do is to kind of reframe the way that we think about freedom in the digital age.
That's interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, we hear all this rhetoric about technology being liberating, right? That it's giving us more choices and connecting us to the world in all these unprecedented ways. And I mean, there's definitely some truth to that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the internet has really opened up this whole world of possibilities in terms of information, communication, even just creative expression.
Right. But at the same time, I think it's really important to be aware of those subtle ways in which our freedom is being constrained or even manipulated, within these digital spaces.
I see what you're saying.
So, like we discussed earlier, the gig economy is a perfect example of this. You have this promise of flexibility that so often masks these, precarious working conditions and this lack of basic labor protections.
Yeah, it's like we're being sold this new version of freedom that's actually just like a more subtle form of control.
Exactly. And it's not just about work either. Think about the way that social media platforms are using algorithms to curate our news feeds and to filter our search results, even suggest who we should be friends with. It's designed to keep us engaged, to keep us scrolling and clicking and generating more data.
Right.
Which can then be used to target us with even more ads and to further kind of shape our behavior.
So we're all just living in this giant digital Skinner box, and we're constantly being rewarded for staying within the parameters of the system.
I mean, that's a pretty bleak way to put it, but yeah, I see your point. It's really easy to kind of get caught up in that dopamine rush of the likes and notifications and feel like you're in control when you're actually, being nudged and manipulated in these very subtle ways.
So how do we break free of this digital Skinner box? How do we actually reclaim our autonomy and shape technology in a way that really does serve humanity?
Well, I think, awareness is really the first step. We need to understand those historical patterns and the power dynamics that are at play and the ways in which technology is being used to both, liberate and control us.
I feel like Whittaker's work has given us this whole new lens through which to actually view the world. And now we can't unsee those connections between plantation logic and modern day surveillance capitalism.
Exactly. And once we see those connections, we can start to challenge them. We can demand more transparency, like I said, from the tech companies, and support those movements that are fighting for digital rights and stronger worker protections. We can also just make more conscious choices about the technology that we're using and how we use it.
It's all about being more thoughtful and critical and engaged citizens, but of the digital world, right?
Absolutely.
So recognizing that technology is ultimately a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or it can be used for bad.
Yeah, a great way to put it. And it's not about rejecting technology altogether, right? It's about making sure that we're using it wisely and ethically and in a way that actually benefits all of humanity, not just a select few.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I would just say, don't be afraid to question things. Don't be afraid to challenge those assumptions and imagine a different future, right? Because we do have the power to shape that future. It's in our hands.
That's a really powerful message to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the often overlooked history of computing. And we hope that it's given you all some food for thought and maybe inspired you to take action.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, this conversation doesn't end here. Keep learning and keep exploring these ideas and keep pushing for a more just and equitable technological future.